It's 5:05 and welcome into a Monday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour. News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. I'm Nick Craig. Good morning to you. We start with some breaking international news this morning. Pope Francis, Bishop of Rome and the Supreme Pontificate of the Catholic Church, has died at 88 years old. This happening less than 30 minutes ago, according to a cardinal within the Catholic Church. Dearest brothers and sisters, with deep sorrow, I must announce the death of our Holy Father Francis. At 7:35 local time in Rome this morning, the Bishop of Rome, Francis, returned to the house of the Father. His entire life was dedicated to the service of the Lord and his church. This will, of course, set off weeks of mourning within the Catholic Church. Pope Francis from Argentina was the Pope for 12 years. Of course, over the last few months, he has been fighting some major health issues and apparently some complications dealing with pneumonia, as the Pope did make an appearance yesterday on the very important Easter Sunday within the Catholic Church. We will continue to track these details throughout the morning and pass anything along. Again, if you're just waking up and joining us this morning, Pope Francis dead at 88 years old. That coming out just about 30 minutes ago. We'll keep an eye on it here on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Taking a look at some statewide news this morning, we have been tracking a lot as it relates to Hurricane Helene out in western North Carolina. There is some movement going on in the Congress this morning as it relates to bringing some clarity and insight to HUD in terms of allocation of disaster relief and mitigation funding. A letter sent bipartisan letter sent last week from members of Congress, including Tim Moore, to HUD, asks for some clarity on their Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery. Those are known as CDBDR grants. There's been a lot of discussion about those over the last couple of months. A big request, over $1 billion request here in North Carolina from the governor. Tim Moore said in a press release, quote, "Hurricane Helene taught us the way federal disaster relief funds are distributed and overseen needs some serious improvement. Families in western North Carolina were left waiting without answers, and there was no clear explanation for how decisions were made. This bill shines a light on the process so that we can hold HUD accountable and make sure that we get the communities that need disaster relief the most." The House resolution has been introduced back last week, and we will, of course, track its progress through Congress. We'll see what happens there in the House. In the Senate, of course, there is already that request in for HUD. They take about 45 days to issue funds that are requested. North Carolina, the quickest to ever submit one of these massive CDBDDR grants from HUD after a hurricane. We're about 30 days through that process, so hopefully over the next couple of weeks, hopefully maybe by the end of this month, we'll have some details with how much money Western North Carolina is going to receive from the Department of Housing and Urban Development. We'll keep an eye on those details right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour, where it's now 5:08, News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. While the General Assembly enjoys their spring break this week, it was a busy one last week in the North Carolina General Assembly. Brianna Kraemer from CarolinaJournal.com joins us to recap what was that busy week in Raleigh. She joins us here on the News Hour. Brianna, one of the big pieces of legislation that was discussed last week, and it's kind of been a broader push really across a lot of the nation, is banning foreign entities from owning either farmland or land close to military institutions. The North Carolina General Assembly dealing with that as well.
Yes, that's right. The North Carolina General Assembly is discussing this issue, and in the House, they actually unanimously agreed on Wednesday to ban hostile governments like China or Russia from buying up agriculture land and property surrounding military installations in North Carolina. So this was a unanimous vote, 111-0, and they approved the NC Farmland and Military Protection Act. And so basically, this comes as over 700,000 acres, or 3.5% of agriculture land in North Carolina, is foreign held. And that's according to a report by the Congressional Research Service. So this is in an effort to protect state and national security and really just send a message that North Carolina is not going to deal with adversary foreign governments leasing, acquiring, holding, whatever it is, real estate property within 75 miles of a military installation in the state.
And that would bar individuals that the United States Department of State has deemed as adversarial. The list includes China, Cuba, Iran, North Korea, Russia, and Venezuela. As you noted, Brianna, unanimous in the House. Will obviously track those details in the Senate. Transitioning over to another piece of legislation, House Bill 244 deals with depoliticization as it relates to government property. This one was not unanimous. Some controversy brewing on the House floor over this one.
Yeah, this one's quite interesting. It introduces a measure to restrict non-official flags from being displayed on government property. So the purpose is to maintain a neutral stance on government grounds, state government in North Carolina, by allowing only official flags. So the U.S. flag and the North Carolina state flags, as well as municipal flags that can be flown on government buildings. And that's out in the open. That was one point of controversy that Democrats were opposed to, is what we can't fly, other sorts of flags in the open public view, or can we still have these in our private office spaces and on our desks? And so that was part of the issue. And it comes as both sides of the political aisle have their flags, whether it's a cultural statement or a political statement. Flags are a big deal on both sides. And so we see that, and people send a strong message with flags. And so I think this is trying to depoliticize and kind of calm things down when it's being represented from the state government as a whole.
One of the interesting points that was made during the debate, it was a representative from southeastern North Carolina that brought up the point that this would also transition out for local state governments as well, as some of them are under pressure from time to time to fly certain flags from their constituents. This legislation would give those local governments the ability to say, hey, we're not allowed to do that, and here's the general statute that requires it.
Yes, that's right. And another concern that Democrats raised was First Amendment and government representation. So there definitely was more of a divide on this particular piece of legislation, but it did pass through, and now it moves on to the Senate.
Schools have been a big discussion over the last couple of years in the General Assembly, and obviously education funding continues to be a main story. But one of the biggest things that school district deals with right now is various drugs on campus, whether we're talking about vaping with various vaporizer devices, and specifically dealing with Delta 8 and 9 on school grounds. The General Assembly moving forward with this while the federal government determines whether they're going to outright ban Delta 8 and Delta 9.
Yeah, so another interesting bill, of course, going through the House this week. And this bill proposes a complete ban on tobacco products, hemp-derived products, and their synthetic counterparts. So that's Delta 8, Delta 9, CBD, and vapor products on public school property. So it wasn't too long ago we were having, the discussions about vaping and that sort of concern. And, as time goes on and different things get introduced to students and are issues in the school system in high schools, legislators have to adapt and respond. So I think this is the latest concern that they're seeing in North Carolina schools, these Delta and CBD products. So really, this is just going to ban the use of any hemp products and to clarify the pre-existing ban on tobacco products on school grounds, like vapes and e-cigarettes.
This is kind of a whack-a-mole for the General Assembly. Right? These products seemingly pop up every couple of months, every couple of years. You've got a new product, in this case, Delta 8 and Delta 9, a synthetic equivalent to some THC products that pop up, Brianna. And the General Assembly, they've got to act pretty quickly because this stuff has been sold in the state now for multiple years. And I guess school students, if they were able to obtain them, could bring them on campus.
Yeah, that's right. And that's the issue, is through the rise in popularity of vape products and e-cigarettes, now hemp products, school districts in North Carolina have struggled to get a handle on students' use of these new substances. and how they're going to handle it, because the General Assembly in different committees, they've discussed other substances that students or young adults have access to, even like gas station drugs. That was something we covered last year. It was the gas station drug that students can get a hold of. And these aren't regulated. And, really they're maybe like prescription strength drugs, or they're advertised as something that will help you to focus. And so they slowly come to market. People learn about it, start using it quietly. Maybe it gets passed around school or certain groups of students, and then it becomes a widespread issue that they're now having to deal with at the state legislature.
And obviously, we'll continue to track its progress through the North Carolina General Assembly. We'll continue the recap with Brianna Kraemer from CarolinaJournal.com coming up after this. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour. Where it's now 5:15, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. It's time to get a look at traffic on your Monday morning. A look at the roadways with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thank you, Nick. All quiet.
It's 521. Welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour. News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. I'm Nick Craig. Good morning to you. A recent Catawba College YouGov survey reveals a significant divide in how North Carolinians perceive the health of American democracy, with partisan swings playing a major role. Meanwhile, residents express greater optimism regarding democracy at local and state levels. The survey conducted last month shows that North Carolinians are essentially evenly split on their views of the national democracy, with 35% being optimistic, 35% being neutral, and 30% being pessimistic. This is just a little bit of a shift from January, when pessimism stood at the highest level at 32%. Optimism hovered at 27%, and neutrality led with 41%. The divide reflects stark contrasts between political affiliations. Democrats have grown notably more pessimistic, with those expressing outright pessimism jumping from 31% in January to now 45% in March. Optimism among Democrats fell from 32% to 24%. On the other side of the aisle, optimism among Republicans surged as their party regained national control in January. Optimism rose from where it was at that time, 30% to 56%, while pessimism plummeted to just 8% overall. Dr. Michael Blitzer, a professor of politics and history and the director of the Center for North Carolina Politics and Public Service, who commissioned the poll, said, quote, "The health and perception of the American democracy is crucial to our self-governing system. If you simply look at the percentages at the most extreme responses, 0 for American democracy has failed versus 10% for American democracy is the strongest it's ever been, you'll find fundamental shifts in how partisans view our civic health. Democracy went from 7% in January saying a 0, that American democracy has failed, to now 14%. Conversely, Republicans, who gave American democracy a 10, went from 4% in January to 10% in March. There was also a significant shift to more optimism amongst Republicans from their January response. Yet again, partisanship seems to be dictating how Americans view the health of their democracy. When asked about democracy at state and local levels, North Carolinians were more optimistic. For state democracy, 32% expressed optimism, 48%, said they were neutral, and 20% were pessimistic. Views on local government's even more favorable, with 35% saying they were optimistic, 49% neutral, and only 15% pessimistic there. Republicans reported the highest optimism about state democracy at 43%, while 32% of Democrats and 26% of independents shared similar thoughts. At the local level, 44% of Republicans are optimistic about their local government, compared to just 38% of Democrats and 27% of independents. This March survey, commissioned by Catawba College's Center for North Carolina Politics and Public Service, polled 1,000 North Carolinians with a margin of error of about 3.5%. You can read the entire poll this morning. We've got a link to the Catawba College study up on our website, carolinajournal.com, where it's now 524. News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. Continuing our conversation this morning with Brianna Kraemer from carolinajournal.com, recapping what was a busy week last week in the North Carolina General Assembly, turning our attention to some sad news this morning. Hurricane Helene leaving so much devastation and destruction, more than 100 people losing their lives in North Carolina. This has brought forward Elena's Law. This is a really sad story, Brianna.
This is a really sad story to hear. And in the state legislature, they heard from different victims and one woman who was related to Elena Iyer. She was a 31-year-old from Mitchell County, and her body was swept away along with her husband's in the aftermath of Hurricane Helene, with the floods and the rising waters. They were both missing. But to this day, her body remains missing. They did find her husband's body, and he was pronounced dead. But there are 5 people, including Elena, out in Western North Carolina, who remain missing after this catastrophic flooding. And so since her husband's body was recovered downstream in Tennessee, but her body has not been found despite efforts from law enforcement and volunteers. So she is presumed dead, but the problem under state law is that she can't be technically, or I guess legally pronounced dead for 7 years. And really, this has to do with the death declaration and basically all that you do after a person has passed away. All of the different things that the family would have to handle, like legal matters, such as estate settlements, child custody, and insurance claims. So right now, they are having to wait 7 years to handle all of these matters, even though they have presumed that she's dead. So there's this piece of legislation that legislators explained is to help expedite this process. And when there's some sort of natural disaster, it's going to allow the families to legally declare a loved one dead sooner if they have been missing following a natural disaster.
Yeah, obviously getting those, obviously dealing with the whole situation as a whole is incredibly devastating. Then not being able to deal with said individual's affairs for potentially up to 7 years is really not practical, especially, Brianna, one of the examples you mentioned and was mentioned during the debate, something like child custody. I mean, that needs to be dealt with pretty quickly. And as it stands right now, they could have to wait up to another 6.5 years to get that dealt with.
Yeah, and that's definitely difficult for the families that are already grieving and going through so much. And so just a legal matter like this just creates further complications. So one of the representatives that was explaining the bill said that this isn't a piece of legislation that is going to impact millions of people like most things do that are going through the GA, but it's going to have a big impact on just a handful of families. So might not affect everybody in the state, but this is something that will really have an impact on, the families that are needing some closure and needing to close some things out when they lost their loved ones.
And obviously, it's great to see the General Assembly working on this quickly and getting this dealt with just about 6 months or so after Helene affected the state. Let's turn our attention to House Bill 211, another sad story here. This is the Kelsey Smith Act, and this deals with receiving, as I understand it, Brianna, cell phone location data, that law enforcement can get that in a more rapid way if this legislation were to move forward.
Yes, that's right. So this is another sad story. So for some background context on it, Kelsey Smith, she's a young woman who was abducted, assaulted, and murdered in 2007. According to legislators, they were describing the need for this law. And so they said, despite law enforcement citing emergency circumstances, it took 72 hours to obtain her phone location data. So once law enforcement received her cell phone location data, they were able to find her body within 30 minutes. So they would have, if basically the cell phone carrier company would have worked quicker with law enforcement, they would have been able to find her body and maybe altered the outcome of this scenario, this situation. So this bill aims to expedite law enforcement access to cell phone location data during emergencies involving imminent threats to safety. So in response to this very, very sad situation, some legislators say that we need to pass a law so that we can require these telecommunications companies to quickly work with law enforcement.
Now, with that, of course, there are privacy concerns with this. The fact that without a warrant or subpoena or any sort of court document, law enforcement can obtain your data is a very valid and real concern that I'm sure many North Carolinians and people across the country would have. As I understand it, as it was described, that lawmakers seem to claim that this bill is very narrow in its scope and is not going to be used all that often.
Yeah, that's right. Some did question some of the constitutional concerns, particularly under the Fourth Amendment with violations and whether allowing officers to obtain location data without a warrant could lead to evidence suppression in court. But one of the co-sponsors of the bill said that this situation must qualify as an exigent circumstance, so emergency circumstance. And he also pointed to some Supreme Court rulings. that would apply to this situation. And also of note, this bill is supported by the North Carolina Sheriff's Association and the state's District Attorneys Association. So it did have support from those groups as well.
Brandon, we only covered about 5 or 6 bills this morning. We've got dozens more that were flying throughout the halls of Raleigh over the last couple of days. Where can folks get some additional details this morning, not only on what we talked about, but all of this other legislation that's been boiling up there?
Yes, we've got a full list of all the legislation that went through the General Assembly this week. It was a very busy week, so you can go to carolinajournal.com to see all the latest there.
Brianna Kraemer joins us this morning on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Where it's now 5:31, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. It's time to get another look at traffic this morning with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thank you, Nick.
Get ready, Charlotte. The Mech Mile presented by Albemarle is back at the American Legion Memorial Stadium coming up on May the 10th. Whether you walk, run, or jog, there's a spot just for you. All ages, all speeds, everyone is welcome. Kids 13 and under run for free when they register. You can sign up this morning at mechmile.com and score your custom medal and t-shirt. It's the Mech Mile presented by Albemarle coming to the American Legion Memorial Stadium on May 10th. Mechmile.com this morning for registration and details. Recapping some international news as we kick off the program this Monday morning. Pope Francis has died, according to the Vatican, in an announcement coming out just about an hour or so ago. History's first Latin American pope, who, of course, charmed the world with his humble smile and concern for various groups across the world. Pope Francis suffered from chronic lung disease and had part of his one lung removed as a young man. He was admitted into the hospital back on February the 14th of this year for a respiratory crisis that developed into double pneumonia. He spent a whopping 38 days in the hospital over those last couple of months. Getting some reaction in this morning, J.D. Vance, the Vice President of the United States, tweeting out, quote, "I was happy to see him yesterday, though it was obvious he was very ill, but I'll always remember him for his homily he gave in the very early days of COVID. It was really quite beautiful. May God rest his soul." Obviously, this is going to be a major international story. If we get any new details this morning on the program, we'll pass it along to you right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Taking a look at some other statewide news this morning. There's a lot that has gone on and did go on in the General Assembly last week. Dozens of pieces of legislation as the filing deadline for both the House and the Senate has now come and gone, meaning that all the legislation that is likely to be dealt with in this legislative session has already been introduced. We've already seen the Senate version, Senate Republicans' version of the budget, expecting something from the House over the next couple of weeks, in which there could be some legislative priorities, but in terms of standalone legislation, standalone bills themselves, all of those have been introduced. As we mentioned earlier this morning with Brianna Kraemer, the General Assembly is in fact on their spring break this week, so we will not be seeing any movement on any legislation out of the General Assembly. They are slated to be back 1 week from today, coming up next Monday, April the 28th. They will be back and begin the additional processes going back and forth between the House and the Senate over the budget, and of course many different pieces of legislation traveling from one chamber to another. In the slower times, of course, we'll keep you up to date with other statewide news over on our website, carolinajournal.com, and right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour, where it's now 540, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. We are tracking a lawsuit this morning that goes all the way back to 2020 as it relates to a protester being arrested during times in which government shutdowns were taking place all across the country. To get some details on that this morning, Mitch Kokai from the John Locke Foundation joins us on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Mitch, hard to think at this point, almost 5 years ago, we were discussing COVID-19, governments shutting down, people scrambling for toilet paper and various supplies, and here we are a couple years later now, and we've got some legal challenges that are still working their way through the legal system. What's going on in a courtroom coming up early this week?
Yeah, you might remember that when all of the confusion and chaos surrounding COVID-19 struck, among the things that happened were lots of shutdown orders. Governor Roy Cooper had his executive order that caused most businesses to shut down and other restrictions on people's ability to live their lives normally. That prompted a number of protests, including protests by a group called Reopen NC. And in April of 2020, not too long after the shutdowns, this group held a protest just across the street from the governor's mansion in the state government complex and called for the order to be overturned and to allow people to live their lives in a normal way again. Well, at the end of this protest, as people were leaving, one of the protesters said she wanted to get some video and photos of people leaving. And so she threw, I believe it was her stepson, threw the car keys to him and let him drive off. And then after everyone left and she's getting the footage, the law enforcement officers were there, said, well, you have to leave, because they had told people to disperse. And she said, oh, I can't. My ride just left. And they arrested her. And so she was charged with violating the executive order. Later on, she was also charged with trespass and was convicted in Wake County District Court on those charges. Now, eventually, she ended up taking some community service and having the record expelled, but that took several years. It wasn't resolved until February of 2023, and shortly afterward, she filed suit, first in federal court, claiming constitutional violations, but also that process moved forward with a judge in federal court throwing the case out last year, but leaving some of her state constitutional claims intact. So she went back to state court, and the hearing that's taking place this week is on the government defendant's motion to have this case dismissed. They're saying that there's no constitutional claim here. There's no reason for this case to move forward. And so what we're going to be hearing in this courtroom setting is the reasons why or why not this protester who was arrested during all of the chaos about COVID-19 will be able to sue government officials over alleged constitutional violations, including free speech and the right to assemble. They also, the claim also is that the law enforcement officials engaged in a conspiracy, that they wanted to use someone as a test subject to arrest so that other people wouldn't get involved in these protests. So it'll be very interesting to see how that all plays out when this gets to court.
Now, Mitch, as you mentioned, obviously this happened while Democrat Governor Roy Cooper was in the governor's mansion when all of this was taking place. Like other lawsuits that you've walked us through over the last couple of months, does this transfer to new leadership in the case of Governor Josh Stein now sitting in the governor's mansion?
Yes, Governor Stein is officially one of the defendants in this case, and that is just by virtue of the position. Stein was not, he was Attorney General when this was happening, but Stein was not targeted as one of the initial defendants. Now, because he is the governor, he takes over from Roy Cooper as being a defendant. Among the other defendants are the heads of the Department of Public Safety, the State Capitol Police, the General Assembly Police, Raleigh Police. We also had DA Lauren Freeman was a defendant. And all of these defendants are trying to get the state case thrown out. They filed a motion to dismiss. They filed paperwork during the course of the past week talking about why the case should be dismissed. But also you saw the plaintiff file paperwork saying, look, this was a conspiracy designed to stop people from expressing their frustrations and engaging in their constitutional rights. And so this plaintiff was made an example of so other people would not get involved in these protests or think twice about doing it. And so it'll be very interesting to see 5 years after the COVID scare and 2 years after the legal proceedings in a criminal case were resolved, whether this lawsuit will be able to move and proceed.
Let me ask you about that. I mean, is there any reason that this has taken almost 5 years to come to fruition, Mitch, or is this just another good old example of the slow wheels of justice slowly turning?
Well, one of the reasons why this case is coming to the court as it is now is that the criminal process took so long. The initial criminal case, initial civil case, the lawsuit, only came about at the end of the criminal proceedings, and that took 3 years. In fact, that's one of the arguments that's being made, is that this dragged out, that long after most everyone had forgotten about COVID and gotten back to their lives, criminal prosecution was continuing, and it was the criminal case was only resolved in February of 2023, almost 3 years after the protests that led to the arrest. So that was one of the reasons why you saw the plaintiff in this case go to the courts, because she said, look, this was a long-standing conspiracy against me, and most everyone else who had anything to do with protests, including other protests that were taking place at the time, didn't face this type of criminal, in her words, harassment. And so the reason we're seeing the lawsuit at its state now is that the lawsuit followed the criminal proceedings, and the criminal proceedings lasted almost 3 years.
You can read some additional details on this story this morning by visiting our website, carolinajournal.com, and obviously we'll continue to provide updates as they are relevant to our readers over there. Mitch Kokai from the John Locke Foundation joins us this morning on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Where it's now 547, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Time to get another look at the roadways on your Monday morning. A look at traffic with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thank you, Nick. We can.
Good morning again. It's 5:53. Welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour. Don't forget that if you missed any portion of our program, live weekday mornings, 5 to 6 right here on WBT, you can check out the Carolina Journal News Hour podcast. Get it wherever you get your shows, whether that be Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play. Just search for the Carolina Journal News Hour, tap the follow or subscribe button, and take a new program with you each and every weekday morning. It's the Carolina Journal News Hour podcast. Download and subscribe now. The North Carolina Supreme Court is set to determine whether a private contractor known as Truesdale Corporation must share responsibility with the Robeson County Sheriff's Office for a workers' compensation claim owed to Deputy Sheriff Stephen Lassiter. He was injured when moonlighting on a 2019 Department of Transportation project. Lassiter was struck by a vehicle while directing traffic during off-duty work on a DOT bridge preservation project along Interstate 95. The State Court of Appeals ruled in December of 2023 that both the Sheriff's Office and Truesdale were jointly responsible for Lassiter's injuries. The construction company appealed that, arguing that they did not employ Lassiter and that the Sheriff's Office maintained control over his work. Lawyers for that company claimed that the Sheriff's Department maintained control over Lassiter and that the Sheriff's Office was the one directing his actions. However, lawyers for the sheriff and Lassiter countered Truesdale's claim, saying that they hired, paid, and exercised oversight over off-duty deputies and should be deemed a joint employer under workers' compensation law. The case carries broader implications for state law enforcement across North Carolina, as many officers depend on off-duty jobs for additional income. If the court rules in favor of Truesdale, Sheriff's Office may restrict moonlighting, potentially hurting recruitment and retention of officers. Chief Justice Paul Newby and Justice Trey Allen raised concerns about the consequences for both officer safety and the willingness of private companies to hire law enforcement for off-duty work. Meanwhile, Lassiter's attorneys emphasized the importance of properly calculating off-duty income in compensation claims like this. The state Supreme Court has temporarily blocked the appeals court ruling and confirmed that it will review the case. At issue is whether Lassiter's work for Truesdale qualifies as joint employment, which the Court of Appeal affirmed. Citing Truesdale's role in staffing, supervising, and project coordination, even if no formal employment contract existed. The outcome could redefine liability in cases where law enforcement officers are injured while performing off-duty work for private contractors under public infrastructure agreements. As was in the story there, many times you see off-duty sworn law enforcement officers that are moonlighting for various private entities and companies, and as was noted in some of the opinions in the court system, depending on the outcome of this case, it could have some pretty major impacts as to if moonlighting is even allowed by sheriffs and police departments across the state. Do private companies want to take on the risk and the liability of hiring an off-duty police officer or sheriff's deputy, with them having some of this increased liability? This will be an interesting case to follow its way through the courts, something that took place all the way back in 2019, finally making its way to the state's highest court. We will await some details and opinions from the North Carolina Supreme Court. As soon as we get those details, we will pass them along to you right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Well, that's going to do it for a Monday edition. WBT News is next, followed by Good Morning BT. We're back with you tomorrow morning live right here, 5 to 6 a.m., right here on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT.